The committee will come to order. Good morning, everyone. And on this bright day and historic day, and as Nancy Altman pointed out to me, it's also a historic day in terms of it being Francis Perkins' birthday. So we're proud to have dropped Social Security 2100 on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's birthday, and equally proud that we have such a distinguished group of panelists this morning to talk about not only preserving Social Security, but enhancing it in a number of the proposals that we've had come before the committee. Tom and I were just discussing, and I think this is clear on both sides, that what the American people want and what the American people deserve are solutions. And the last time that Congress seriously did something about Social Security, Ronald Reagan was the president, Tip O'Neill was the speaker. We believe that it's long overdue for us to move forward on this issue, especially given the pressing nature of what's happened to so many Americans. As the AARP points out, those between the ages of 50 and 64 are the most worried about their future, and polling data would support that. That's why this committee is holding these hearings. We're shining a light on all the options to enhance and expand Social Security, because to do nothing is not an option, and we've pointed that out statistically. What happens in just 15 years, actuarially, and most importantly, what happens to individuals would be devastating across this country. And I firmly believe that our colleagues on both sides of the aisle are committed to getting the job done. Let me start by complimenting the President of the United States. The President, I think, both in his book and also when it really mattered, when there was a bright light during the course of the debate that was shined on the issue of Social Security, when pressed to say whether it was an entitlement, President Trump resisted and said, no, it's an earned benefit. And in fact, as he said in his book, it's a deal that we made a commitment to, and he intends to keep that. Our polling has shown that Americans are remarkably in agreement on changes they want to see in Social Security, that they want to see protected and expanded. Social Security, after all, represents the full faith and credit of the United States government. And that's why we're proud to say that it has a 99% loss ratio. For those of us formerly in the insurance business, that explains the efficiency of this program. And to American citizens as well, who only have to check their pay stub to understand that this is an insurance plan, they do so by looking at FICA, which stands for Federal Insurance Contribution. Whose? Theirs. And so essentially every American knows that this is the nation's insurance plan. It's our bedrock retirement security program. It's essential for the middle class. Millions of Americans rely on it. In fact, a new GAO study reports that nearly 50% of American households 55 years and old have no retirement savings. That's an incredible statistic when you think about it. After the Great Recession 10 years ago, many saw their retirement savings wiped out. And according to economists at the Federal Reserve, on average, the bottom 90% of households have not regained the wealth they lost in the recession. We have a retirement crisis, and Americans are relying on Social Security as the floor of their retirement now more than ever. That's why we need to act and move forward as a committee. One of the reasons we've asked Steve Goss, the Chief Actuary of Social Security, to be here today is so everyone can understand the challenge we face in terms of Social Security's financial status. He also will discuss what solutions are, and I want to note for the record, as he would want to make sure as well, that the actuary is strictly neutral. I've asked him to spend a few minutes explaining the 2100 Act and the most critical point from my perspective, and I think everyone's, is sustainable solvency. He has prepared an actuarial analysis for many other bills and welcomes questions of all proposals. We believe that Social Security needs to be expanded, and Social Security Act 2100 does that in 4 ways. Number one, we make an increase across the board of 2%. Let's be clear. Nobody is getting wealthy on Social Security, but it is essential for people's basic subsistence that as Americans we make sure that they're able to live out their lives in dignity. Noting that, we also recognize that for many Americans, far too many, they find themselves retired after paying in all their quarters but still living in poverty, even with Social Security, because the last time that plan was adjusted was in 1983 and should have been indexed, but was not. And so we create a new floor for Social Security that will be 125% of poverty, therefore assisting and abetting and lifting people above the poverty level. We also provide a tax break for seniors because, again, back in 1983, it was deemed that if you were single and making more than $24,000 a year, your Social Security was taxed. If you're a married couple and making $32,000, it was taxed. So we raised that to $50,000 per single and $100,000 per married couple, and that amounts to 12 million Americans getting a tax break. We also follow what the AARP has been recommending for some time called CPI-E. E standing for the elderly, but also the essentials that the elderly need is how I like to talk about it. And that means, the doctor visits, the prescription drugs, the nutrition, the physical therapy, the heating and cooling of their homes. These are, again, essential for people being able to survive. And, of course, also making sure that this is, as actuaries like to say, sustainably solvent. And that means that it's solvent beyond the 75 years and therefore called Social Security 2100. There are a lot of good ideas that this committee will come up with and move forward with, and we will continue to discuss, but I'm pleased today that this is the 4th hearing that we're conducting, and we're going to be able to hear from these distinguished panelists. But before we do, first, my good friend and ranking member, Tom Reed.
Well, thank you, Chairman. And as you referenced Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan working on Social Security, I know in this partnership, I think I know who Tip O'Neill is, but I definitely know who's not Ronald Reagan. So it's good to be with my good friend John Larson, and I appreciate that. So thank you, Chairman Larson, for holding this hearing today. I'm happy to join you to discuss the proposals to improve Social Security benefits to reflect today's people and the families we all care about. At our last hearing, I shared my personal story of being raised on Social Security. I'm the youngest of 12, and my mom, Betty Barr Reed, raised me and my 11 other older siblings on her own with a Social Security check and a military death benefit check after my father passed when I was 2. My personal experience taught me the importance of Social Security and why it is critical we protect this program, not just for today's beneficiaries, but for our future beneficiaries as well. When I was a law school student, I aspired to work with those less fortunate and in need of legal services. My father was a career military veteran. Even though he died when I was 2, I learned from his legacy of service I wanted to do my part to give back. However, my dreams quickly faded when I graduated with over $100,000 in student loan debt. That debt was crushing to me and my wife, Jean. That debt limited our career choices and forced us to rethink all our decisions: when to start our family, where to live, and what path to pursue professionally. My wife, Jean, worked many jobs and waited tables while I studied for the bar and applied for jobs at places such as Blockbuster. For the millennials here, don't see too many of them, There's one. That is our generation's Netflix. To say we struggled to get through those early years right out of college would be an understatement. I can't imagine having an additional increased tax burden, a smaller net paycheck, as included in the proposal that's being submitted today, on top of all the debt Gene and I were already working so hard to pay off. And Mr. Chairman, as you know, the issue of exorbitant student loan debt is not improving. It is getting worse with each passing year as higher education fails to lower its cost to make college affordable. As a result, future generations of leaders fall further and further behind. Mr. Chairman, I know you, and I want to say here today, I care about these young people. Young people like my own children, Autumn and Will. Republicans care about these young people. Democrats care about these young people. We want to ensure they experience an economy that rewards the value and dignity of a hard day's work. That's why we cut taxes for Americans across the board, giving young people an economy that works for them and gives them a fair shot at achieving the life of their dreams. As a proud Republican, I believe work provides dignity and opportunity. Work is good for your bank account and good for your soul. Work is not a dirty word. We care about making sure young Americans are rewarded for their hard work, not penalized with a potential 20% increase in the payroll tax. As we will hear today, raising payroll taxes is not only bad for small businesses in our economy, but unfairly hurt young people. It hurts the students struggling to pay their rent and pay for their next meal. We want to empower the next generation with tools to save for their retirement in a way that works best for them. We need a Social Security plan that addresses the needs of Americans today and the needs of Americans down the road. That is why we cannot go down a path that would protect today's beneficiaries on the backs of their grandchildren. Today's retirees don't want that. Those just entering the workforce don't want that. And you can be sure the Republicans on this subcommittee don't want that either. As I said before, the mission of the Republicans on this subcommittee is to secure benefits without tax increases. We want to leap with you in a bipartisan manner so we can make sure all Americans can count on Social Security to be there for them, for their children, and for their many grandchildren to come. LEAP represents the principles of the Republicans on this subcommittee. Long-term economic growth by rewarding work, equal treatment for public servants, acting now to protect future generations, and protect the most vulnerable people through focused reforms. This hearing and regular order are an important part of the process to develop a Social Security proposal that meets these principles and works for all Americans. We, as Republicans, are here to listen. So as we continue this conversation about Social Security and receive input from Americans from all walks of life, we cannot forget about the next generation and the recent college graduates who are already drowning in student loan debt. Only by listening first can we have a truly bipartisan, comprehensive solution to Social Security, and only after listening to all voices first will we present a plan that we hope you will consider in our deliberations to sincerely fix the long-term threat to the viability of Social Security. In closing, we care about these young people, we care about our present retirees, we care about those about to retire. Thus, in this endeavor, we will fight at every turn to ensure they all have a fair opportunity to achieve their dreams and, in particular, live their retirement years in a prosperous, secure manner. With that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the Republican leader, and we have a distinguished panel of witnesses here with us today to discuss the important issue of legislation to enhance Social Security. And let me introduce them, and then we'll start. Ms. Diane Stone from the great state of Connecticut, who for 21 years has been the director of the Newington Senior and Disabled Center. Welcome, Ms. Stone. Mr. Stephen Goss, as you have, I talked about in my remarks, is the independent chief actuary of Social Security, has served in the office since 1978. He is the definitive source of cost estimates, and he does not take positions on any legislation, but is here to help understand the various options. Nancy Altman, the president of Social Security Works, leads a broad coalition of groups that support protecting and enhancing Social Security, a longtime expert on Social Security. Ms. Maddie Duppler, a senior fellow for fiscal policy of the National Taxpayers Union, has been working on fiscal policy for over 10 years and has a list of credentials that would take me about a half hour to read. So, Maddie, welcome here. Mr. Sean Castle, an American hero, Deputy Executive Director of Paralyzed Veterans of America, representing veterans and others with spinal cord injuries and disorders, an Army veteran who was deployed to Kosovo, Macedonia, and elsewhere around the globe, a professional athlete, as well as he's a star of wheelchair basketball. Congratulations, Mr. Castle. And of course, Mr. Max Richmond, the President and CEO of the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, representing millions of seniors who want to see Social Security strengthened and enhanced. Welcome again to each and every one of you. And each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety. I would ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less. To help you with that time, there is a timing light at your table. When you have 1 minute left, the light will switch from green to yellow and then finally to red when your 5 minutes is up. We'll begin with the nutmegger, Ms. Stone from Connecticut.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the Social Security Committee for the opportunity to come before you today to talk about the importance of Social Security to the people that we see every day and to tell you some of their stories. I've been the director of the Newington Senior and Disabled Center in Newington, Connecticut for 21 years. We're a suburban community just south of Hartford with a population just over 30,000, and 25% of our population is age 62 or older. The Senior and Disabled Center was the first in Connecticut to achieve accreditation through the National Council on Aging, has a membership of more than 1,600, and we see 200 to 300 people a day. We have a robust information and referral center, and we work with our town's Human Services Department to provide our residents, especially those who are struggling, with the help they need to live as full members of our community. Out of the thousands of people in Newington who receive Social Security, it would be difficult to find anyone who would say it's not important. It's the foundation of retirement for all Americans, providing a stable, guaranteed monthly income. Between their Social Security, pensions, and savings, most of our residents can live modestly but comfortably for most of their lives. The people who come to see us in our social services offices are those who are having trouble making ends meet. They may be above the poverty line, but they don't have enough to live on. According to the Elder Economic Security Index, a homeowner without a mortgage in Connecticut needs $2,180, and a couple needs $3,124 just to cover their basic needs. Most of our clients are well below that. Social Security is critical to everyone we serve, but it's not enough. Most of our clients planned for their retirement. Those plans were based on assumptions that we all make, like how long we think we're going to live. In my written statement, I talked about Rose, who started working at age 17 in 1935, the year Social Security was signed into law. She went on to work another 60 years, retiring at 77. When she and her husband Bob planned their retirement, her life expectancy could be predicted to be about 85. Bob passed away about 15 years ago, and Rose lives quite independently in her own home on her Social Security of $1,200 and a small pension under $400. We all look forward to celebrating Rose's 101st birthday in the fall, but no one, including Rose, could have predicted she'd live so much longer than the actuarial tables said she would. We assume that our family structures are going to remain intact, but that's not true for an increasing number of people. The divorce rate for women over 65 went from 3% in 1980 to 13% in 2015. I told you about Janet. With both of their Social Security checks, she and her husband would have been comfortable, but they divorced, and she's living on less than $1,900 a month. She tried to make things work, but she's going to lose her home, and she doesn't know where she's going to go. We assume that we're going to be able to work until full retirement age, building up our Social Security savings and pensions. Mr. H thought that. He and his wife lived comfortably on his salary as he worked in the hazardous waste removal industry for almost 30 years, and he worked at sites like Ground Zero and Katrina and closer to home at Sandy Hook Elementary School. The exposure to chemicals and the emotional trauma really took its toll, but if that wasn't enough, in 2011, he got hit by lightning. He was no longer able to work, exhausted his unemployment and most of their savings. Fortunately, he was approved for Social Security disability. So with $2,600 now coming in, they are far from rich, but they're not going to lose their home. Of course, Social Security is not only important to current retirees. Every colleague and every friend that I've talked to has expressed that Social Security is a critical part of their retirement plan. It is for me. I understand that currently the program can pay full benefits until 2034. That's the year that I'm going to be at full retirement age. Upon signing the Social Security Act, President Roosevelt said, "We can never insure 100% of the population against 100% of the hazards and vicissitudes of life, but we have tried to frame a law which will give some measure of protection to the average citizen and to his family against the loss of a job and against poverty-ridden old age." It's my hope that this promise made some 80 years ago will be kept for the people before me and for the people after me, and that Congress will take the steps necessary to ensure that is so. Thank you.
Thank you. Done extraordinarily well, Ms. Stone from Connecticut. And now, Mr. Goss, will you respond?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Reed, members of the committee. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. We actually have 6 other folks from my office here. We work all the time on Social Security and these issues, not only on the actuarial status of the program under current law, so we can instruct you as to what the shortfalls are coming forward when there are such, but also to work closely with you and your staff on proposals such as we're talking about today to try to fill in those shortfalls and make sure that Social Security will be sound and firm for the future, and that the American public will well understand that. I have to confess that actually there was one problem I had with Chairman Larson's opening statement. Actually, I started Social Security back in 1973, so I've been around for a while, 5 years even longer than indicated. So 73. So I've been there through a few things, including, I should say, the last comprehensive legislation that we had, as Chairman Larson indicated, which was back in 1983. We worked very closely on that with folks in the House and the Senate, including the Greenspan Commission and another commission even before that. One of the things that came from that, and Chairman Larson referred to this, was the realization at the time of the 83 amendments, we were able to provide projections that gave us an expectation of 75 years of solvency for Social Security. The issue with it was, though, that the nature of the fixes in the 83 amendments were going to result in a relatively large trust fund buildup and then a rapid decline down. From that came a notion which we've been working very closely with members of Congress and others on since about the mid-1990s, called sustainable solvency. And that's really, sustainable solvency is really very straightforward. It's simply making sure that we end up with the next legislative reform, hopefully, that we have, that will be the comprehensive fix that's intended to make sure we have 75 years of solvency, being able to pay the full scheduled benefits throughout the next 75 years, have it such that our trust fund reserves at the end of the 75-year period are not declining, that they're stable or rising as a percentage of the cost of the program. And if we're in that position and our projections and our assumptions for the future come true, then we know we'll be in a sound footing, not only for 75 years, but for the foreseeable future, even beyond that. So that's what we're sort of hoping and planning to do. If we had interim legislation that got us partway, that'd be okay. But if we're talking about comprehensive reform for Social Security to be able to extend us into the 75 years and beyond, the sustainable solvency is really a very, very important concept. Now, as already mentioned, if we do not act in a timely fashion, we are looking at 2034 as being the year in which we will have our trust fund reserves on a combined basis. We have 2 trust funds. On a combined basis, they will be depleted in 2034. But that doesn't mean close the doors, we're bankrupt, as sometimes people say. It would mean that, in fact, at that moment in 2034, we project that we would still have 79 cents coming in for every dollar of scheduled benefits. That's far from nothing, but it's not the 100 cents on a dollar that people are expecting for their scheduled benefits. And by 2092, speaking to sort of the stability of the program after 2034, that 79 cents on a dollar would drop to 74 cents on a dollar of tax revenue still coming in to be able to support benefits. So we have some work to do. How can we address these shortfalls? Well, one possibility is that we could increase revenue to the program by about 29% over what's scheduled now. We could reduce the scheduled benefits by about 23% or some combination. Now, putting this in sort of terms that I'm sure you all, for lots of different programs, everything the federal government does, think of things in terms of the percentage of GDP. The cost of Social Security over the next 75 years for the scheduled benefits is about 6% of GDP. High, low, Our view on this, and we believe yours is also, Social Security benefits are all about what the American people want and what they're willing to pay for. So the question is 6% of GDP, is that where we want to be? We want to be more or less than that. The problem is that the scheduled revenue for Social Security is at the level of 5% of GDP overall for the next 75 years, so we're 1% of GDP short. As we move out into the more distant future, as the demographics change, that shortfall actually becomes, after 2034, it's about 1.4% of GDP. So to sustain the level of benefits that are currently scheduled, we're going to have some increase in the revenues, or we're going to have to cut back in the benefits as mentioned. One thing that I think is really important is that financial planners tell us that in retirement we should have 75 to 80% of the level of earnings that we had during our career. Social Security at this point provides about 40% on average for scheduled benefits. Now that's for somebody retiring at 65. If you retire at 62, it might be more like 32% on average. And if we fail to do anything, that could be cut by 20% when we get out to 2034. There have been many comprehensive proposals. In the few seconds I have left, I'm so glad that Chairman Larson went through the particulars of the bill, because since '83, we've looked at a number of comprehensive proposals. The only one that's been introduced in recent times in this Congress and the last that would really achieve sustainable solvency, I think in either House or Senate, is Social Security 2100 Act, which is introduced in this Congress and also in the last Congress. Very, very similar. And I guess the key thing I would want to mention, if I could take one more second, is that we have a 1% of GDP shortfall over the next 75 years. The bill would satisfy that. It would give us extra revenue to cover the 1%. It would, in addition, provide an extra 0.3% of GDP over and above that to provide some enhancements, a little bit less than 5% increase in the level of benefits as per schedule now. And on top of that, another 0.1% of GDP of extra revenue that would give us a bit of a cushion in terms of the solvency of Social Security going into the future to maintain sustainable solvency. Because again, a key thing is, as I'm sure you all know, Social Security, unlike much of the rest of the government, does not have the ability to borrow. So we have to keep those trust funds strong and keep them positive. And wish I had more time, but sorry.
We'll give you more time in the questioning. Okay. Ms. Altman.
Okay.
Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the subcommittee. The Social Security 2100 Act currently has no Republican co-sponsors, but the voice of the people tells us that it is fully bipartisan. Poll after poll shows that an overwhelming majority of Republicans support expanding, not cutting, Social Security. Just a few weeks ago, the Pew Research Center released a poll that found that 68% of Republicans, and those leaning Republican, believe that Congress should make no cuts to Social Security whatsoever. Another poll conducted shortly before the midterms found that 55% of Republicans would be more likely to vote for a candidate who supported expanding Social Security. As I explain in detail in my written statement, an expanded Social Security is fully affordable. As I also explain, expanding Social Security would strengthen the economy. An AARP report found that every dollar of Social Security benefits generates $2 in economic output. In 2012 alone, Social Security benefits generated over 9.2 million jobs, created around $1.4 trillion in economic growth, and accounted for over $222 billion in tax revenues. In my written statement, I include a chart showing for each of your congressional districts the number of Social Security beneficiaries and the monthly benefit amounts that flowed to each of your districts in December 2017. So how should Social Security be expanded? In light of the nation's looming retirement income crisis, benefits should be increased for all current and future beneficiaries. The Social Security 2100 Act does that, but I don't believe the increase is large enough. Social Security benefits should be made fully adequate, doubled or even more for America's working families. In addition to across-the-board increases, there should be targeted increases. The Larson bill increases the special minimum benefit. Representative Sanchez's Power Act should be enacted. I discuss in my written statement a number of other important targeted increases. So how should these expansions and Social Security's projected shortfall be paid for? By law, Social Security cannot add a penny to the deficit. It can only pay benefits if it has sufficient revenue to cover the cost. It has 3 dedicated sources of income: insurance contributions, investment earnings, and the dedicated revenue from the taxation of Social Security benefits. Only that third source is progressive. It accounted for just 3.8% of Social Security's total revenue in all of 2017. Additional progressive revenue should be dedicated. The last few decades have seen rising income and wealth inequality. That inequality is a major contributor to Social Security's projected shortfall, as I explain in detail in my statement. There is bipartisan support for increasing Social Security's revenue. A National Academy of Social Insurance survey found that 69% of Republicans, 76% of independents, and 84% of Democrats supported, quote, increasing Social Security taxes paid by working Americans, unquote. Each of those already very high percentages increased when the question was whether top earners should pay more. While I believe Congress should increase Social Security substantially and pay for it with additional progressive revenue, I recognize that the Social Security 2100 Act to be sound, thoughtful legislation. It is a consensus proposal. Progressives like the benefit increases, conservatives, its tax cut, and its provision requiring everyone to pay more. My colleagues and I look forward to participating as this important legislation is considered through regular order and voted on by this committee and the entire House of Representatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Ms. Dupliger may respond.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Larson and Ranking Member Reed, for the invitation to join you here today. I want to applaud the entire committee for the important work that is being done on the policy question before us today, and that's protecting Social Security. As was mentioned before, my name is Maddie Duppler. I am the Senior Fellow for Fiscal Policy at the National Taxpayers Union. And I want to spend some time today focusing my remarks on a group that doesn't get much attention when we're talking about Social Security, and that's young people. Most of my remarks today will focus on millennials because that is the generation for which we have data on their working lives. But I would encourage the committee to consider the impact on future generations of the American workforce on some of the policies before us today. For many millennials who entered the workforce during the recession, the recent economic expansion has been their first opportunity to grow in their careers and build wealth. However, the looming fiscal insecurity of federal spending, coupled with proposals that would force this cohort to shoulder new tax burdens, threatens to undermine any progress. 2019 marks the first year where millennials will overtake baby boomers as the country's largest living generation, making up a full quarter of the population. Data shows that they differ from other generations in ways that will be very significant for public policy. For one, millennials are more likely to start their own business. In fact, a recent PwC survey said that over a third of millennials currently operate what is known as a side hustle. That is in addition to their full-time job. This means young people in the workforce today are both employees and employers. This also means that increases in the payroll tax fall heavily on this cohort. The Social Security 2100 Act proposes increasing the payroll tax to 2.4 percentage points, split between the employer and the employee. A sole proprietor or someone operating a side hustle or operating their own business would be responsible for both of these increased liabilities under this plan, potentially increasing their payroll taxes in the future by thousands of dollars. For workers who are focusing on growing their careers inside of an existing business, an increase in the payroll tax further erodes opportunity for them. A 2.4% increase in the payroll tax will result in an employer who hires a college grad at the average starting salary of $50,000, facing an additional $600 tax burden for that employee, hiking the payroll tax cost for that employee to $3,700. The deadweight loss of this income is another question entirely. Data on millennials also show that they hold more debt than cohorts at similar stages in previous generations. You, of course, heard from the ranking member about student debt. That is a primary focus for this generation. but they generally lack the same rate of asset and wealth accumulation. An increase in payroll taxes exacerbates this divide by depriving young workers of the means to save and grow their own wealth. On the subject of saving, the noble and necessary goal of providing a social safety net for all Americans, particularly in retirement, is very important. But the demographic demands now placed on Social Security require embracing a more holistic approach to retirement security. The beneficiary-to-payer ratio has changed so drastically since the program's inception that Congress must work to strengthen and secure Social Security without simply shifting its growing costs and liabilities to future generations. This requires improving the financial literacy of younger generations to prepare them to save for their futures. Congress itself has acknowledged the importance of expanding opportunities and vehicles for savings outside of Social Security. From the creation of 401ks and IRAs to the bipartisan passage last year in this body of the Family Savings Act, the importance of expanding savings opportunities is clear. Conventional financial wisdom dictates that the best time to start saving is today. This is because each day that passes is a missed opportunity to grow wealth and to accrue interest along the way. As such, confiscating a larger share of the burgeoning incomes of younger workers robs them of the resources to begin their own savings journey. This disparity will widen with each year that passes without reforms of Social Security and be exacerbated by reforms that expand that tax burden on young workers. Lastly, I would urge members to consider the consequences to economic mobility. Increasing the marginal cost of an employee ultimately represents an additional barrier to wage increases. Both CBO and the Social Security actuaries expect employers to cut salaries in response to an additional payroll tax levied on high-income earnings. What's more, the income exemptions in this bill are not indexed to inflation, meaning they eat up a larger share of employee income over time. This will further erode young people's earning opportunities as they move up the income ladder. The workforce today looks different than the workforce of different generations. This is a feature and not a flaw of the American system. As our economy evolves, however, so too must our public policy, and I thank the committee for its commitment to preserving Social Security for the future generations and appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Knupler. Mr. Castle, please respond.
Chairman Larson, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Reed, members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for the invitation to testify today on behalf of the Paralyzed Veterans of America on the importance of Social Security to millions of veterans like myself, and to express our views on ways to preserve and strengthen this valuable program. Social Security is a vital social insurance program that Americans have paid into to fund retirement, disability, and survivor benefits earned through their work life. Over 9 million veterans receive Social Security benefits, either retirement or disability, accounting for 18% of all adult beneficiaries, and veterans and their families comprise of 35% of Social Security recipient population. For the broad population of veterans with disabilities, it is Social Security that offers a more comprehensive system of supports, not only for veterans themselves, but their spouses, dependents, and survivors. Due to their catastrophic disabilities, most of PVA's members would likely be eligible for Social Security disability insurance. For those who have non-service-connected disabilities, SSDI may be their only source of financial assistance if they are unable to work. My own story begins in 2003 with a training accident while I was in the Army that damaged my spinal cord. 2 unsuccessful surgeries over the course of several years left me with permanent spinal cord injury. By the time I was granted SSDI in 2009, I was not working because of my injuries. I had run out of my sick leave. My only income was $700 a month compensation from the VA. I was less than a month away from being homeless, running out of food, and dealing with the physical, psychological, and emotional ramifications of 2 failed surgeries, permanent disability, and the loss of my livelihood. Being granted SSDI enabled me to finally get into an accessible home and to start to put my life back together. Having Social Security and the Medicare coverage that came with it gave me the financial and medical benefit security to recover from losing my career twice in a 5-year span. And Social Security's work incentives supplied me the assurance for me to pursue a new life and new opportunities. I returned to school in 2014. Then in November 2017, I accepted my current position at PVA. And now I am past my trial work period and fully off of SSDI benefits. I really have SSDI to thank for being there when I needed it the most and the role it played in helping me to get to where I am today. Once again, the confluence of concerns about the deficit and Social Security's longevity have reached a point where it is necessary that the careful steps be taken to preserve rash actions that could damage this essential American social system. Social Security did not cause, nor is it a contributing factor to the deficit. While we recognize the need to address the modest shortfall that is projected to arise in 2034, we believe it should be done with great care and without failing to deliver on this country's promise to veterans and others who depend on Social Security benefits. PVA has supported many efforts over the years to protect and strengthen Social Security. As Congress looks to reform Social Security, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for introducing the Social Security 2014 Act. In particular, PVA applauds the provisions in this bill that would establish a more realistic cost of living adjustment for beneficiaries, strengthen protections for low-income workers and for all beneficiaries, cut taxes on benefits for nearly 12 million beneficiaries, and make long overdue adjustments in the financing mechanisms for the system. We also appreciate your effort to recognize that Social Security's disability, retirement, and survivor protections are all part of one unified system by eliminating the artificial separation of trust funds. PVA also applauds the fact that Social Security actuaries have determined that this bill will ensure the long-term solvency of the trust funds, making sure it will remain strong for future generations. This legislation demonstrates that preserving and strengthening Social Security can be done without causing harms to the beneficiaries, many of whom rely heavily on its programs for their economic security. As my testimony illustrates, Social Security is much more than a retirement program. Even as policymakers are preoccupied with the long-term health of the Social Security program, they must not overlook Social Security's role as a sustaining foundation for millions of people with disabilities. I was fortunate to be able to return to work. For others with spinal cord injury or any other significant injury for that matter, they may not be able to pursue full-time traditional employment. That is why it is so important that any changes to Social Security take into account the impact on all beneficiaries. Thank you, Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Reed, and members of the subcommittee for your attention this afternoon. PVA stands ready to work with you and your colleagues in fashioning legislation that extends and enhances Social Security, the crown jewel of our nation's safety net.
Thank you, Mr. Castle. Mr. Richmond, will you respond?
Chairman Larson, Ranking Member Reed, and subcommittee members, thank you for holding this hearing and inviting me to testify. While there are additional bills we do support that also improve benefits and extend solvency, Nancy Altman mentioned a couple of those, my testimony today will focus on the Social Security 2100 Act. For the last 84 years, Social Security has been an overwhelmingly successful program, which continues to be essential to the retirement security of most Americans, including our own Nettie Hales, a resident of Washington, D.C. Nettie's in the audience today, joined by other members of our National Committee Capital Action Team. They like to be called CATS. That's the acronym. You can't miss their yellow T-shirts. So I didn't realize, Chairman Larson, that today was Frances Perkins' birthday. Today is also Nettie's birthday. Nettie, raise your hand. Hey. She's 91 years old today.
Happy birthday, Nettie.
Thank you for being here, Nettie, and to all of our cats. After raising 4 children and working in real estate, Nettie claimed Social Security benefits at age 65 in 1993. Her husband, Edward, a Baptist pastor who helped organize Martin Luther King's March on Washington, passed away in 2006. In addition to her own Social Security benefits, Nettie began receiving a survivor benefit after Edward's passing. Today, Nettie's main source of income is Social Security. She manages her money wisely to pay for medical expenses, upkeep on her home, property taxes. There's not a lot of room for many extras except an occasional outing with her church group or family dinner. Nettie is proud to stay within her means, but says it's tough to keep up because of the high cost of living. So that's where Social Security 2100 Act can make a world of difference for Nettie and others like her. A 2% across-the-board increase equaling about $300 annually for the average retiree. A fair cost of living index would give Nettie a modest boost to her monthly Social Security income. And as Nettie is spending her money, as has been pointed out earlier in the hearing, it goes into the local economy, helping strengthen local businesses and their economy in that location. Chairman Larson's bill also gives Nettie reassurance about the future for her 2 adult children, 6 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild, since the Social Security 2100 Act would extend solvency until the end of this century. So they, too, could have income protection in retirement, disability, or death. Nettie and other National Committee members from across the country aren't the only ones who support proposals like the Social Security 2100 Act. Celinda Lake, a leading national pollster, says that polling results over 70% are considered, quote, home runs. If that's the case, Chairman Larson's bill hits grand slams. In a 2017 poll conducted by Ms. Lake for the National Committee, 79% of respondents supported paying for an increase in benefits by having affluent Americans pay the same rate into Social Security as everyone else does. In 2014, a National Academy of Social Insurance poll found that 77% of Americans agreed that it's critical to preserve Social Security for future generations, even if it means increasing Social Security taxes paid by working Americans. In fact, the NACI poll found that 7 in 10 respondents across generations and income levels supported a package of proposals nearly identical to Chairman Larson's bill. Given these results, H.R. 860 represents a consensus, I believe, of an overwhelming majority of Americans, including Nettie, including our cats, to improve Social Security benefits and to place Social Security on solid financial footing for the next 75 years and beyond. It strikes the right balance, we believe, between the overall financial needs of the program and specific needs of current and future beneficiaries. Mr. Chairman, the National Committee proudly endorses H.R. 860, and we look forward to working with you, members of this subcommittee, and the Congress to enact this common sense legislation. Thank you for the chance to participate.
Thank you, Mr. Richmond, and thank you to all the panelists. And I want to announce to the committee members here that we will have 4 votes will be called around 10:15. That should allow us to get through all the subcommittee members with everyone sticking to 5 minutes. And hopefully we'll have some time left over for the 2 non-subcommittee members that have joined us here today. Let me start by saying, Mr. Castle, first of all, thank you for expanding on something that's often forgotten about Social Security with respect to what it means in terms of disabilities and what it means in terms of dependent and spousal coverage as well. There's nowhere in the private sector that you can purchase, as a former insurance person myself, you can't go out and purchase that. It's the full faith and credit of the United States government that allows us, and Eddie, happy birthday, but as Mr. Neal, our chairman of the committee of the whole, often says, you can outlive an annuity, but you can't outlive Social Security because it's the full faith and credit of the United States government. Mr. Castle, what would it mean to you and other veterans for this proposed legislation to become law?
Well, Chairman Larson, thank you for that question. For myself personally, I am at the prime time for when it comes from my earnings for my lifetime. I was fortunate enough to be able to go back to work and start paying back into the system. To know for myself personally that the next 20 and hopefully 30 years or longer that I work, that when I retire, I don't have to worry, as you mentioned, about going and finding a private policy that would actually insure someone with a disability. It doesn't exist. I'm someone who can tell you right now, I've tried to get private life insurance policies. I've tried to get private health care. I've done everything possible. They will not insure someone with a spinal cord injury, even a veteran. So to know that when I do retire again, hopefully I can get to that age where I can retire again, that will be there for me, that will be there for other veterans and other people with disabilities. It's invaluable security for us to be able to live our lives. That's something that cannot... peace of mind they always say you can't put a price on, but this you can, in a sense that it does give us the peace of mind that when we do retire or need those benefits, they are there for us.
Thank you, Mr. Castle. Ms. Stone, how you mentioned a number of the anecdotes. How were their lives, how would Rose's life, how would people's lives be better if this Social Security Act if Social Security were expanded?
Thank you. So I wish everybody could meet Rose. She's living on her Social Security, as are other people I talk about in my written testimony. Josephine, who's 92 and is living on $1,100. But they're not living well. They're scrimping and saving everything that they do. They live in that gap between poverty and economic security. So any increase in benefits obviously makes their lives better. And by better, I mean it allows them to maybe turn the thermostat up a degree or two. It lets them make choices between, fresh fruit or non-fresh fruit. When I told Rose that I was coming here today, I asked her, is there anything you'd like me to tell them? And she said, please don't take our Social Security away. So economic security is not just about the numbers, it's that feeling of security. And even at 100, she's not so secure that her money is going to be there. So I think it would help.
In 2034, Mr. Goss, if we do nothing, what happens to Social Security recipients like Eddie and other people?
I wish I could tell you precisely what would happen. What we do know for sure is that at that point in time, the continuing tax revenue coming in would cover only 79% of the cost of what are in the law now the full scheduled benefits. So a decision would have to be made at that time what exactly to do. Would every beneficiary get a 21% cut, or would we handle it in some other way? But what you should expect is that we would have on the order of a 21% reduction in what people are getting from 1 month to the next.
A 21% reduction. Ms. Altman, I was watching, I'm a student of body language, and I was watching the discussion as Ms. Doppler was talking about the generational strain, et cetera, between millennials and also, I guess, baby boomers, of which 10,000 a day become eligible for Social Security. How would you respond to Ms. Doppler in her comments?
In several ways. Thank you for that question. First of all, millennials are protected today in the event of disability or death leaving dependents. So they are benefiting from Social Security right now. On top of that, our polling shows that the younger you are, the less confident you are to have Social Security. But if you ask the follow-up question, well, then do you think benefits should be cut? They say no. They do not want to see benefits cut. They understand that they have parents, grandparents who are dependent on it. So there's not an intergenerational divide that we see. Families are better off, children are better off if their grandparents are secure, grandparents are better off if their children are educated without coming out with burdensome debt, and we are a wealthy enough country that we can take care of both, ensuring retirement security and economic security for working Americans.
Because of time, let me yield to my good friend, Tom Reed, for his questions.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman, for this. And I do appreciate the Chairman's commitment to regular order, because this allows us to have this conversation that we need to have on this mission to protect and secure Social Security. So first, I echo the happy birthday wish to Nettie. God bless you. And I wish you 100 more on top of the 99. So we'll work towards that. And to Ms. Stone, please tell Rose, we're gonna work together to protect Social Security and her benefits, as well as the future benefits that are coming, because Rose is just another, in my mind, vision of my mom, Betty. It's the same exact story that we all know and we're committed to doing. But as we go into this conversation, I want to make sure that we go into it eyes wide open. And that's why I was so pleased to invite Ms. Dupler here as a representative of a voice that needs to be heard in this mission to protect Social Security, because she represents the future. She represents those millennials that are going to be in a position to have to burden some of these hard choices that we're going to have to make here. And I just want to make sure we all go into this eyes wide open and recognizing what these impacts are going to be. And so what I wanted to use my time for is really to focus on that millennial voice today. And to focus first, you heard Ms. Altman talk about how millennials in her polling do not believe Social Security is going to be there for them. Is that something in your experience that you find is the truth?
Excuse me. Thank you. I certainly think that that is the case, and that may be the pervasive wisdom for other generations as well, which is why we have had such a robust savings culture emerge in the United States. That is why I think it is important to acknowledge that the burden that extra taxes place on generations today represent potentially a disenfranchisement of younger generations from that savings culture because they don't have the resources or the means if their take-home pay is reduced in a way that doesn't allow them to save for their own futures. Ms. Stone earlier mentioned that Social Security is a part of both her retirement plan and for many of the people who she sees in Connecticut. I think that is true for most Americans, where Social Security is intended to be a part of a retirement journey and not the entire plan. That is certainly true when it comes to millennials. Millennials, I think, have for a long time understood that Social Security and the financial liabilities under Social Security represent an opportunity for them to think about their futures holistically rather than just as a one program that can take care of them. Now, that means, though, of course, giving them the opportunity and the resources to save for their own retirement or for any other life circumstance.
So I appreciate that. So in answering the question, you said yes, that is true. So if millennials do not believe Social Security is going to be there for them, and then we're talking about a tax increase on the proposal that my colleague has submitted on the payroll tax, what would that tax increase do to you as a millennial in regards to your lifestyle, your impacts today?
Well, the payroll tax for most workers is the highest tax that they pay. It is larger than their income tax liability, and that is true for American workers who are making anywhere from $0 to $200,000. So that is something that we talk a lot about, the progressivity of the income tax code. The payroll tax is regressive. It takes up a larger share of lower income workers.
So if I could, if we're asking millennials to bear a higher tax increase in a program they don't believe is going to be with them, do you believe that's a fair burden to put on millennials?
I think that that demonstrates to millennials the way that Washington does not represent their interests, if that is the ask that is being made of them.
And so this is the issue that we have to bridge as we go through this conversation, because, Mr. Goss, you're an actuarial, and you know, in 1973, I was 2. So I respect the wisdom of, as I was taught by my mom, to respect the wisdom that you offer us here today as a statesman and a senior person who's dealt with Social Security for years. When we look at the tax increase that's being proposed, and say the average wage is about $50,000, how big of a tax increase is that going to be on Ms. Dupler and her fellow millennials?
Well, if you're making $50,000, which is close to the average or median, an extra 2.4% on that would be what, on the order of about $600 per year.
Times their work life, right?
And if your work life, if you work for 35 years, that'd add up to about $21,000. But compare that, but again, remember, for you as an individual, that's 1.2% more of your pay.
But as you heard about the side hustles and how this millennial generation seems to be very entrepreneurial and creating their own businesses, and that's shared by both.
If I may mention one thing about the side hustles, and I'm sure this is not true, Ms. Dupler, but over half of all self-employment income in the United States is not reported for tax purposes, and therefore is not going to be credited for Social Security benefits either. So that is one little challenge that we have.
And just so we're clear, I think she was not referring to illegal schemes. These are side hustles that are fully reported to the IRS, and trust us, I hope you don't get audited now.
That's what we want to hear. That's what we want to hear.
But with that being said, I just want to go into this eyes wide open and put a magnitude of, we're talking about a serious burden here, and we just got to have a conversation about it, which I appreciate the chairman's willingness to commit to this in an honest and open way.
Mr. Pasquale.
Yeah, the last time, Mr. Chairman, that we had any movement on Social Security, interesting, is in 1983. There's a lot of movement on issues from 1983 to 1986, 87. As you know, we had real tax reform. Democrats and Republicans came together, and they made a decision. Bill Bradley, Congressman Kemp from Buffalo.
Part of my district.
Democrats and Republicans really sat down and worked out a good reform plan. They had hearings. And they had witnesses, a lot of witnesses. You know, make comparisons in your mind. These are the facts. So it can be done, though. I mean, there is no evil wall between Democrats and Republicans. It can be done. Under a Republican president, by the way. So it was done. No question about it. That's the last time that anything was done about tax reform or Social Security. So, you know, it's possible. We're educable. It's very possible. So I went back, Mr. Goss, to a letter that you wrote in 2017. It's a great letter. And you've been a real advocate. And you've been objective. You know, maybe that's not so good in Washington, D.C., but that's my thoughts, my perception. And you wrote that, assuming enactment of the proposal, meaning Mr. Larson's proposal, this is April 5th, 2017, we estimate that the combined Social Security Trust Fund would be fully solvent, able to pay all the scheduled benefits in full on a timely basis throughout the 75-year projection period under the intermediate assumptions of the 2016 trustees report. And you go on to show why. I don't think you've changed your mind since. Have you?
No, our current projections are much the same.
You haven't changed your mind. That's good. So I just had some comments to make. And by the way, I wanted to ask Mr. Richmond, did you agree with the assessment of Ms. Dupler in responding to the question about the payroll tax and its potential in paying for the revenue needed to sustain Social Security for 75 years? Do you agree with that assessment of the, you know, none of us like any taxes, but you got to pay for things. Put your mic on, please.
There's a little confusion about how that works because this is stretched out over 20 years. This is not an increase of that percentage in 1 year. So the impact of it is going to be staggered over a long period of time. I think it's 22 or 23 years.
24.
24 years, so even better. So we're not going to go from an payroll tax of 6.2 to 7.2 on each side in 1 year. I think that should be clear. The other thing I wanted to, if I could, respond to the millennial issue, because I think Congressman Reed raises a very good point. The reason, I think, and I hear about this from younger people at town hall meetings all the time, the reason younger people don't feel Social Security will be there in the future is they have been bombarded by negative messages for years. The program is broke. It's not broke. The only way the program could be broke is if we had 100% unemployment and no money came in. It's not bankrupt. There's a shortfall, needs to be fixed. The chairman's proposal fixes it. So it's no surprise that younger people are disillusioned when they hear the program's broke, there's no money there, it's been stolen, all of that.
Just wanted to conclude with this. Thank you, Mr. Richard. You know, this fantasy, and I must say even to my beloved chairman, about where the President of the United States stands and why the hell did he propose $64 billion in cut to the SSI? If he is so committed to protecting Social Security, so there's a bumper sticker mentality and there's the reality. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Pasquale. Mr. Estes is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all our witnesses today. Following some of the work that the Ways and Means Committee's done over the last 2 years to jumpstart the economy, we look at more people that are out working, and now we've got some work to do to help prepare for their retirement after all of those careers are over. And, a big piece of that's making sure that we protect Social Security for current and future workers. One of the things my mom tells me to do is to make sure I protect Social Security for her, but also make sure I protect it and preserve it for her grandkids, my kids. And so that's a mission that we've got to keep up as we go through and look at how we make this insurance program work for all of America. At this moment, if we don't do nothing, as Mr. Goss pointed out, so Social Security trust funds for retirement is going to be 21% short. And people will basically get 79 cents on the dollar starting in year 2034. And so obviously that's something we've got to act on now and move forward. I believe it's an issue that Republicans and Democrats can and should work together on to make sure it happens and make sure that we do that protecting and preserving Social Security for all Americans. However, we want to make sure that the solution doesn't cause some devastating tax increases that end up slowing down our economy, which has some unintended consequences of reducing the amount of money that goes into the trust fund and making sure that then we create unintended problems moving forward. And, the plan, HR 2100, does that because it talks about increasing taxes, which will unfairly hurt millennials and make it harder for small businesses to start up, to give employees the raises and help expand that business. So instead of those tax increases, we need to look at how do we make sure the benefits get to those people who most need them, how do we make sure that it rewards work, and how do we make sure that we modernize the program. I served as Kansas State Treasurer before I came here, and I know firsthand the importance of retirement security. When I was treasurer, we had to take some serious look at our Kansas public employee pension system. When I came into office, we were the second worst plan in the country in terms of being underfunded, and we had to make some tough decisions about how to get that plan turned around and move that forward. And I think some great work has been done. We're making some progress there. We want to make sure that same kind of leadership and action now is done to help protect and preserve Social Security. We know that Social Security doesn't treat all workers fairly. We see that particularly if we look at like one-wage earner versus two-wage earner families, which by extension hurts working women. And Mr. Goss, your office regularly publishes information on rates of return on Social Security for different classes of workers, and your work shows that the rate of concern is consistently different for one earner households versus two earner households. Can you briefly describe some of the factors that lead to that discrepancy?
Absolutely, thank you. And really, fundamentally, the nature of Social Security is not intended to be exactly the same equity for everybody. It does have built-in certain features, like the benefit formula itself gives a higher replacement rate for people at lower earnings levels than for people at higher earnings levels. Similarly, by family structure, as you're describing, if we have a couple that's a one earner, it's well understood that if we have people retiring, that it costs more for two people to live at a given level than it does for one. So that's part of the social adequacy component of Social Security, to have extra, we call them auxiliary benefits for a spouse, especially if they're not insured in their own right, and in some cases for child beneficiaries too. So it is true that if you have a couple where both are working, they will not get as much back per dollar that they put in, but that's part of the redistribution that occurs within the program. And that can be changed by a change in law.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Duppler, Social Security benefit doesn't reflect necessarily the modern economy, particularly where working women and particularly ones that want to be entrepreneurs. How can we talk about how do we help those working women, particularly entrepreneurs that end up having to pay both the employer and the employee share?
Well, for one, on the comment that was made previously about the payroll tax, a gradual increase in a regressive tax is still a regressive tax increase. So someone who is also earning less money or at a disadvantage when it comes to the formulas in the Social Security benefit, that will be exacerbated by an increase in the payroll tax, particularly for women who on average spend 10 years out of the workforce as caretakers, either of children or other members of their family. That divide will only be expanded by a reduction in their take-home pay via an increase in the payroll tax.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Estes. And I would, before I call on Mr. Higgins, I'd just like to point out for the record as well that, again, there's a tendency to refer to this as a tax, and it's an insurance premium. And people know this, by the way, just so my colleagues are informed, because they look at their pay stub and it says FICA, Federal Insurance Contribution. Do you know of any other tax that, by the way, you receive a disability benefit, spousal benefits, dependent coverage, and a pension plan? And oh, by the way, is there any place in the private sector where you could get that, whether you're an entrepreneur or not? Of course not. And with that, I yield the floor to Mr. Higgins for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would say that in Congressman John Larson, there is not a stronger, more consistent leader in the protection and the strengthening of Social Security. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this is the fourth hearing that we've had. We appreciate your leadership on this issue, your persistence, and your compelling and elegant defense of a program that's become critical to the nation's elderly and to the nation's economy as well. And it's no surprise that Mr. Larson has put together all of you. You're all leading figures in your own right in the fight to protect and strengthen Social Security. Max Richmond talked about the misperceptions that are out there about Social Security. And just to provide some context, the federal debt today, primarily because tax cuts don't pay for themselves, is $21 trillion. We will have federal deficits over the next 4 years consecutively of $1 trillion annually because tax cuts don't pay for themselves. The cost of American taxpayers on the national debt is $1 billion every single day. By contrast, the 84-year-old history of Social Security, or as Mr. Larson has said, the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, workers contributed $21 trillion and paid out $18 trillion in benefits, leaving $3 trillion surplus. So I think the federal government side could learn a lot about managing its finances from Social Security. You know, President Trump, then candidate Trump, said on May 7th, 2015, at 11:38 a.m., that he was the first and only GOP candidate to state that there will be no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. He repeated that as a candidate and then president 57 times. 57 times. We were given a budget that included a $1.5 trillion cut to Medicaid. After a sleight of hand through a block grant nebulous concept, that cut is actually $777 billion because tax cuts don't pay for themselves. There's also a $25 billion cut over 10 years in Social Security, including $10 billion from the Social Security Disability Program. And there's an $845 billion cut in Medicare because tax cuts don't pay for themselves. Infrastructure pays for itself. The Mueller report paid for itself. Costs federal taxpayers $25 million, but it recovered $48 million in asset forfeiture and also fines. So I think we're dealing here with a situation where, as it has been said, 52 million people receive Social Security benefits each year, 60% of whom, that is a majority of their income, but they spend it. So they create 9 million jobs because of the economic growth from the aggregate demand that's created by people that get Social Security benefits and spend it in the economy. High demand, high growth. Mr. Richmond, I just want to give you an opportunity to elaborate, and then Ms. Altman, about this whole issue, about the misperception about Social Security and what it is and what it isn't. Sir.
Seen polls and surveys, and I've heard from individuals who think they're more like younger people who think they're more likely to see a UFO than to get a Social Security check, or to see Bigfoot than to get a Social Security check. And I think, as I said earlier, I think this is due to a steady drumbeat of misinformation about the program, that it's broke, there's no money there, the money was stolen. And the other point, and all of that is not true, and I think the chairman's bill would put a lot of that to rest, because it would show clearly the program is sound, will be there for everybody for the rest of the century. The other thing younger people, I think, do not fully appreciate, as the chairman said, this is insurance. I think about a third of Social Security benefits go to non-retired workers, spouses, survivors, millions of children. If you are, I think this is still accurate, a 27-year-old worker today with a spouse and 2 children, you have about $500,000 in value of life and disability insurance. And you may not even know that unless something bad happens in the family and someone says, you know, Social Security is there for you. So it's there right now, and it will be there in the future. And the bill being talked about today will make that clearer than ever.
Thank you. Mr. Arrington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do thank you for your sincere efforts to solve a very challenging problem, but a very important program for all Americans, and I think we all agree with that, and I think we all agree that we won't get anywhere in this committee, and we won't get an outcome, no outcome will be ideal for either side, but we won't if we don't work together. Let me, though, talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because that continues to come up at every hearing, and I guess we're reading from different newspapers, or we have different facts on the fact that the economy has finally grown after 10 years of stagnation. I mean, we had no growth, no wage increase, and we've got millions of job opportunities. You know what millennials need about as much as anything else? And you know, they would probably see Bigfoot before they'd have seen a job had we not had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because there wasn't much hope for a good quality of life for them and opportunities to pursue their dreams in this country with the economy the way it was. Now, Republicans shouldn't take credit for that any more than government should take credit for creating jobs. We just took the burden off of our job creators, and they did what they do best, and that's invest in their companies, expand and create jobs, and we just made them more competitive. And they did the work. But to suggest that tax cuts don't pay for themselves, I think 1% over the 10-year baseline is $3 trillion. It cost half of that for the tax cuts. Now, I'm for paying for things. I agree that we should offset anything. And that's, I respect you, Mr. Chairman, for at least having an offset for what you want to do to expand benefits. I respect that. Now, I'm opposed to it in terms of raising taxes because of everything Ms. Duppler was talking about and the additional burden that it puts on. Now, ultimately, we're going to have to figure out a deal, but I'm just telling you, I'm not for raising more taxes on the American people, on the American workers, because it hasn't worked. And by the way, the previous president doubled the debt, Mr. Higgins. I mean, he doubled the debt. Now, I'm not saying that Republicans, we weren't the fiscal stalwarts that we claim in my first term. I will admit that too. But we should deal with facts and reality. And the reality is a loss of almost 4% of income for our future workers and the millennials is significant. That's not just a cup of coffee. The cumulative effect is significant. Again, with all due respect, expound on that a little bit, Ms. Duppler, and I apologize I had to step out, so if I'm making you repeat yourself.
That's all right. We got plenty to talk about here. So to your point about job growth and opportunity, we know that one of the reasons the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was so important was it removed some barriers for businesses, particularly small businesses, which generate the majority of the jobs in this country, to hire and to increase wages for their employees. Increases in the payroll tax, we know, have two effects. One is that employers will reduce high-income earners' wages, excuse me, as a result, to try and make up for the loss of income on the payroll tax side. And for lower wage earners, they typically will take on more debt as their take-home pay decreases and they don't have the resources to deal with the fixed costs in their household budget. So we know the effect of that will be less opportunity. The quality and quantity of jobs supplied by small businesses will also be diminished as well.
Do you think the $22 trillion in debt that both Republicans and Democrats alike have contributed to is just a deferred tax on the millennials and future generation of taxpayers and workers?
Absolutely, and it creates an unstable environment for young workers who are looking for stability in their working lives.
To raise the age, we just passed, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, the Secure Act. We increased the age for mandatory annual distributions from 70 and a half to 72. For employer-sponsored plans, for folks with IRAs. We did that acknowledging that people are living longer as one factor. Why can't we just acknowledge that and recognize that and consider that in how we reform Social Security and make it more sustainable? I apologize for going over my time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arrington. And I would just point out that we're dealing with a human infrastructure here, and we hear many proposals and heard it for the last 8 years about a D- rating with our physical infrastructure. And there were numerous proposals of goodwill, and everybody was all in favor of it, but the roads are still crumbling because it takes money to fix them. And you cannot wish your way to solvency. We have to step up and do something about that. And I recognize Mr. Schneider.
Thank you. And as my colleague said, I think it's important that we do get to common facts and we talk about common perspectives, and that's part of the importance of having discussions like this. I will point out that we just had our, I'm not sure whether it was our 101st or 100th consecutive month of job growth that predates this administration. We have seen jobs growing for almost 8.5 years. I think there's a difference. In 2009, that incoming administration inherited a financial crisis. In 2017, we have it growing. I speak of this as someone who I describe myself as fiscally responsible. We need to stop putting a burden on the next generation. We have a $22 trillion debt. It's growing at $1 trillion a year. This has to be addressed, and I agree, and I hope that there's an opportunity to work towards this. And I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for having this committee. This is, I believe, our third hearing on Social Security, fourth hearing on Social Security, and since the start of this Congress. This is an example of regular order, which in now my third term as Congress, I'm excited to see us moving towards. It is crucial that we have this regular order to discuss proposals, to talk about the impacts, and to develop solutions. It's how this committee and Congress as a whole is supposed to function, and I'm grateful that we're able to do this. Ms. Dupler, as you were talking about, and others have talked about not expecting to collect anything of Social Security, I was thinking in 1973, I was 12. In 1983, I graduated college. Why is that relevant? Because in 1983, as I graduated college, the assault on Social Security is not new. It existed back then. I didn't think I would ever collect a Social Security check. I didn't think that much about it, but at the time, I made the decision to put as much money as I could into my 401k plan and to do what I could to secure my own retirement. But over the last, I won't count the number of years since 1983, but over those years I watched my grandmother live 20 years after the time I graduated college, dependent upon Social Security. It gave her the dignity and security in her final years to live with confidence. And as I've gotten older and my cousins have aged into Social Security, life doesn't work out as we might plan it when we're young. And many of them today depend on Social Security to make ends meet, to afford the things that they have to do. So I'm grateful that I was wrong in 1983. The decisions made by Congress a generation ago in 1983 to give a longer-term stability to Social Security were made. And I am humbled that here we are in 2019, and it is our responsibility to find a path to ensure that it stays there, because so many people do rely on it, and especially people of all ages, as Mr. Castle, you touched on. We don't get to plan what happens to us in our life, but because of programs like Social Security, we have some safety nets that are in place. So that's, I kind of got deflected of what I really had wanted to talk about, which is the impact of Social Security on people who are trying to start a business. And Mr. Richmond, I'd like to turn to you. We've talked about this in previous hearings of how the Social Security program is a platform that allows people to make decisions to venture out on their own. And in your opinion, the enhancements we're discussing today, what are the most important ones for small business owners as we try to create an economy that small businesses is the engine, small businesses are the engine that grow and create the jobs?
Enhancements that we find particularly important in this bill, one of them is the change in the formula for COLAs, cost of living adjustment. And I think as it would affect NETI, our CATs, millions of beneficiaries, and would allow Social Security benefits to keep up with inflation as it really impacts an older person. The current formula is flawed. I know we've talked about this in the past, and this legislation corrects it. I think that would go a long way. That, along with increasing the minimum benefit, those are two of the, I think, aspects of the bill that are most critical.
Great, thank you. And I see I'm almost out of time, so I'll yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Larson, and thanks to each of you for being here. The one thing that I am awfully glad that I am hearing everyone say is how important it is that we save Social Security for current beneficiaries and those nearing retirement. I think it is the fact that, and Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Reed, I truly appreciate the fact that y'all have the courage to bring this up and for us to have these very difficult discussions. It is a challenging topic, and not because we disagree on the fact that we've got to do it, but obviously the mechanisms that are there. Mr. Chairman, I will always take exception with you on one thing, and that is the description of taking money out of private individuals' pockets and putting it into the government and then coming back out not being a tax. You call it an insurance premium, I'll call it a tax. Respectfully, will disagree with you on that, but to call a squirrel a duck, it don't make it work.
Respectfully, would you say that the benefits that they receive are different? What other tax do you know of that happens when you get a disability policy, spousal benefits, and a pension plan? Respectively.
Yes, I will certainly reclaim my time. We can continue. We can continue to carry to have that disagreement, and I do it respectfully, sir. But you know, again, as I look through this is a monumental challenge that we're dealing with, and there's a genuine commitment on both sides of the aisle to work side by side to solve this problem. One of the things that's striking to me is that we're having a conversation right now about not only saving Social Security, and can we all agree that that is the most important thing that we're talking about, but we're also having a conversation about expanding Social Security. And I think that's going to be, you know, that old saying, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. You know, how do you we've got step number one, which is to save and make meaningful changes to honor the commitments and keep the promises that have been made. And I see that as one conversation that has to be done. And then I think we can have a separate conversation about expanding benefits because, as we've all recognized and we've all heard, there are people, our fellow Americans, that really, quite candidly, are falling further behind. And I think we can have some unique conversations and honest conversations about how to take care of the most vulnerable in this country. But I think it's also, I think it really muddies the water and it makes the decisions tougher when you're trying to do both of these things at the same time. I could be wrong on that. I'm fairly new up here. So maybe there is the bandwidth in all of this. But when you do it in the context of talking about making sure that people have affordable health care, affordable prescription drug pricing, access to better paying jobs, doing everything that we can to improve upon education, make strategic public investments in infrastructure. We do all of those kinds of things, and I believe one of the witnesses mentioned that we're a wealthy enough country to do a couple of these things. We can't do it all right off of the bat. We've got to have political patience and a longer time horizon. So one of the things that I think about on this is how do we do it? How do we do step one first? And that is make sure that the promises that have been made will be kept. And I think that from my standpoint, that's my primary focus right now, is honoring the commitments that have already been made. As we move forward on this conversation, I do think it is fantastic that we're not only considering those that are in retirement, but we're considering our children and grandchildren and future generations and millennials right now. So, Mr. Upler, thank you so much for being here. Could you tell me from your standpoint, okay? I'm just curious, what are the do you have more conversations about work right now or retirement? Do people want work or do they want retirement right now? What's the focus? I mean, how do we encourage work for a longer period of time?
I would have more conversations about work. I think that's probably an obvious answer for someone in my age cohort. But as you were talking, Congressman, I think that the question of how do we keep that promise that has been made, that commitment that has been made, and ensure as well that we're not back here in 50 years having the same conversation for the next batch of beneficiaries goes back to my original point about making sure that we are not creating an environment now that decreases the wealth opportunities for workers at this day and age, because inevitably that means we will be in the same position 50 years from now where we are talking about a retirement crisis, and this time it'll be on the private side because Americans won't have had the opportunity to save.
Mr. Kildee is to be recognized, and then what I plan to do is to recognize the two non-members for 2 minutes apiece, and that will take us to about 10 minutes, and that way everyone will have had a chance to respond. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll attempt to be brief, and I know I only have 5 minutes, and you'll enforce that. Let me just say a couple things real quick, and then I have a question. Social Security is the most successful social insurance program in the history of the planet, and we ought to start sort of with that understanding and not continually sort of beat ourselves up for the fact that during the life of this program, we've had to continually adjust it in order to accommodate big changes that have occurred in our society. Most of those big changes are changes we really want to celebrate. I mean, people are living longer in this country. And when Social Security was enacted, the average recipient had been dead for 2 years before they could collect. I mean, this is a big success, and we ought to celebrate that. And the fact that we're going to have to make these adjustments as were made in 1983 is something we ought to celebrate. So if I could just maybe ask a couple questions, maybe Ms. Altman or Mr. Goss could address this. I can't remember the data, but I read at one point in time that the percentage of total aggregate earnings in 1983, when we went through this exercise, that were subject to Social Security taxation is significantly greater than the total aggregate earnings in this country that are subject to Social Security taxation now. Do you have that reference?
Yes. In fact, in 1982, I was Alan Greenspan's assistant on that. And at that point, it was the intention of Congress that the maximum base, that was the cap, that was indexed every year, was supposed to be indexed to average wages nationwide. And it was the goal of Congress to make that 90% of all wages nationwide. Now, what we did not anticipate back in 1982 was the income and wealth inequality we've experienced. And as a result, that 90% now covers about 82%. And that may not sound like much, but it is billions and billions of dollars that Social Security did not get. It stayed in people's pockets.
A really important point, because as we consider how we make this promise work, we have to keep in mind that one of the problems we have to overcome is the fact that so much more of the wealth that is being generated in this country is going to fewer and fewer people at the top of the economy, not all that dissimilar to what we faced in the couple of decades that preceded the enactment of Social Security.
Exactly.
So we have to accommodate that. One other question, and then I'll yield back. Maybe Mr. Rickman could point this out. I do understand that this is hard, and there's 1,000 reasons to be against a thoughtful proposal that our chairman has put forward. And we can pretend that there's going to be some path forward that doesn't require us to make tough decisions, but I don't think that's a good presumption for us to begin with. But I do want to take issue with one point, and that is, while it is arguable that, and I don't necessarily agree with this, that any tax cut pays for itself and any tax increase has a negative impact on economic growth, I would take issue with that. And maybe, Mr. Rickman, you could opine on this. Do Social Security beneficiaries put their Social Security earnings away for the future, or do they spend that money?
Absolutely not. They don't put it away. The money goes right back into the economy. I think we've heard there's a multiplier effect. For every dollar that is spent, I think $2 in impact on economic activity. You know, people are just getting by with their Social Security check. There isn't enough to put away. It's spent. So I think
so a relatively low percentage would be used for stock buybacks, for example. Is that correct?
I wouldn't imagine there'd be too many options to buy stock back. No.
So the money goes into the economy. These beneficiaries are at a point in their lives and are at a point or a place in the economy where it's really important that they use this resource. And so if we were to increase the minimum benefit, that increase is going to go right back into the American economy and have a stimulative effect on the economy.
And I think that's such an important point to make to counter the discussion that's been taking place about what an impact the higher tax has on wage earners and how it might impact the economy. This is a counter to that argument, I think. It's an important thing to keep in mind.
I appreciate that, and I thank you, and I
Would the gentleman yield just those last 10 seconds to ask a question? Mr. Goss, that 90% percentile, what would be the average wage in today's dollars for that 90% percentile?
Oh, thank you very, very much. Because the one little clarification on that is, back around 1982, it was about 90%. By about the year 2000, we dropped down to about 83% of covered earnings falling under the taxable maximum. It's been rather stable at that level since, and we're projecting to continue. If we were to want to go back to having 90%, our taxable maximum now, $132,900, would have to be just a little bit more than doubled.
Mr. Rice is recognized for 2 minutes, and then we'll conclude with Ms. Moore.
Thank you. Everybody on this panel agrees that the promise we made with Social Security has got to be preserved. I certainly recognize what a fundamental program this is to our country and how it has done so much to reduce poverty in old age. In fact, poverty in old age now is less than most ages in our country. But Mrs. Stone, you talked about your friend Rose, who is 90 years old and gets 100 years old and gets $1,200 a month in Social Security and $400 a month in a pension. Under Mr. Larson's proposal, she would get a 2% increase in her $1,200. That would be a $24 a month increase. You also said she's got 2 sons. That's what your thing says, that she has 2 children. So let's say one of those children is a plumber and he makes $50,000 a year. Now, under Mr. Larson's tax increase, 2.4%, if he's a plumber self-employed, he would pay $1,200 more a year in payroll taxes. That means $100 a month more coming out of his pocket. So if you told Rose, said, Rose, we're going to give you a 2% increase, $24 a month, but your son's going to pay $100 more a month, how do you think Rose would feel about that?
So I'm not sure that Rose has sons, but I know she does have children, and one of them could very well be a plumber. So going on that premise, I can't speak for Rose. I do know that for Rose's pocketbook, $24 would make a world of difference. I know that Rose is also very careful that she does manage her own expenses because she doesn't want to be a burden on her children. But I think, I can just speak to what $24 would do in helping Rose.
Well, my point in saying this is we are where we are because we haven't recognized the demographic shifts. I mean, people are living longer, and because of that, we really haven't held enough back in Social Security. That's what we face, and what we're talking about is shifting the burden because we didn't hold back enough in Social Security in prior years to this younger generation to make up the change. And I think if you put it to Rose in terms of how it affects her and her children, I'd like to know her opinion.
I'd like to know her son's opinion also, what it would mean to Rose. But go ahead, Gwen, you're recognized.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of the witnesses. I just want to say, Miss Nettie, I want to be like you when I grow up. And I do want to follow up with where Mr. Rice was going with you, Ms. Stone, because I do think that when elders live beyond the Social Security age, Social Security didn't anticipate that the life expectancy, that there would be a Rose who would live to be over 100 years old. So I do have a proposal that's not included in the Larson bill that would provide benefits for older beneficiaries beginning the 16th year of eligibility. It would increase by 1% of the average retire benefit per year. So to your point, Mr. Rice, as you exit to vote, Rose would see a 5% increase on top of that 2% increase that Mr. Larson would propose. So that would help Rose to not have to beg her son to come over and give some of that money to her. And I just want to say to Ms. Doppler, I admired the millennials. I got a couple of them now who are my grandchildren. You say a third of them are going to be entrepreneurs. There's still 2/3 of them left. And you're going to be elderly one day, too, and you're going to want your Social Security. I do recall my daughter, who's now 49, screaming when she got her first check at age 14, saying, FICA took my money. Who is FICA, Mama? Come down here and tell them to give me my money back. I don't want FICA to have it. And she's real glad at age 49 that FICA is there. But that being said, another bill that I had that's not included in the Larson bill would extend eligibility for certain post-secondary students up to age 22. Very important for millennials. You just can't make it in this world, especially if you're going to be an entrepreneur, without some education and training beyond high school. And this would restore that very important benefit. And so I would just commend to you, Mr. Larson, to incorporate in your very fine bill these two provisions. And with that, I would yield back
I thank the gentlelady.
the time that is expired.
I thank the gentlelady, and I especially want to thank all the panelists as well for your outstanding contribution that you've made today. And I appreciate your continued efforts in your respective positions in order to move the nation forward. And with that, the committee stands adjourned. Well done. Thanks, buddy. We'll see you, we'll get together after the break or whatever.
You got 2 minutes, but 300 unvoted.
300 more, what?
Ms. Stone, before you go vote.
Okay.